All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I am Ric here with my co-hosts Brian Pfeiffer and Jerry Scappaciulo. This week, we are very excited to bring you a recap of labor news for 2022 and a report back from Racine, Wisconsin, where Brian and I visited to do some solidarity work. And just a heads up to our regular listeners, we will be taking next week off because of the holidays, but 2 weeks from today, we're going to come back at you with an episode focusing on Dr. Martin Luther King and his relationship with labor and unions. So we're very excited about this episode as well. We're going to come back to you with today's programming right after we check out this beat I made after I listened to a lot of synth pop.
How many times have they slammed the door in your face because the labor you do is called unskilled? How many times have they slammed the door in your face unskilled? How many times have they slammed the door in your face unskilled? How many times have they slammed the door in your face unskilled? How many times have they slammed the door in your face because the labor you do is called unskilled? How many times have they slammed the door in your face because the labor you do is called unskilled? How many times have they slammed the door in your face unskilled? How many times have they slammed the door in your face unskilled? How many times have they slammed the door in your face unskilled? How many times unskilled? The IWW is not going to take it down because you're unskilled. Or skilled. The IWW is not going to take it down because you're unskilled. Or skilled. Or black. The IWW is not going to take it down because you're unskilled. Or skilled. Or white. The IWW is not going to take it down because you're unskilled.
All right, what's up, everyone? So yeah, it's been quite the year for labor. You know, a lot of stuff happening, a little bit more than the usual. Labor has definitely put out a bit of a fight this year and put itself back on the map in the U.S. You know, so this time around in this episode, we would just like to recognize and celebrate some of the struggles that have taken place this year. So we would like to start first and foremost with the Starbucks struggle, for instance. This struggle has been, you know, from my perspective, from my point of view, it's been unprecedented. It's been a struggle that's been led by a lot of young workers who are new to the labor movement, new to the idea of unions. And, you know, that comes both with new lessons for us who have been involved in a minute and new challenges because, you know, sometimes the old stuff still works and, you know, you got to catch up with the people who are starting to lead it. So, yeah, that's been one of the things about the Starbucks struggle. And my comrades have also been instrumental in covering it for this podcast. So, Brian, Jerry, what have been some of your takeaways from the Starbucks struggle this year?
Well, first off, Jerry and Ric, it's been an honor being here on the podcast with you. We started in January of this year, 2022, and I believe we had 24 episodes and a lot of other conversations. We've interviewed folks all across the country, including the Starbucks workers, which I know has inspired me personally, as well as the organizing I do with you all. And despite the challenges that these workers are putting up against, the outrageous firings, and the attacks that they have faced, they continue to organize all over the country, including the Memphis 7, who successfully waged a campaign to be reinstated after being fired, and still waging a campaign for justice and dignity there. And numerous campaigns continue to take place across the country. So it's been wonderful. We did an interview with a Green Bay, Wisconsin Starbucks worker and have covered many of the battles over the last year. And we look forward to continuing to be on the case with these courageous and brave Starbucks workers who are showing how to fight across the United States and beyond. So, Jerry?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the importance of the Starbucks upsurge in the union organizing was the sort of inspiration it has given to labor in general, especially to young people. Let's not forget that percent of these young folks have never been in a union, didn't know much about union organizing or labor law or anything else. They taught themselves. And this is the essence of the Starbucks struggle, was a totally rank and file struggle. And with very little guidance or input or direction from the International Workers United, which is not a knock on them, but it's just to say that they didn't, this thing took off and became much too big for the union to handle, because it was a nationwide strike involving, well, now 350 stores. So it's hard to think of any union that could manage something like that. But the other thing I want to say about the Starbucks struggle was that this is today's youth movement. And it's akin to the youth movements of the past, the Vietnam movement, anti-war movement is what comes mostly to my mind. And there's nothing that can stop it. It's totally self-directed, rank and file, and inspiring. So it's been a great boost for labor in general, and it's everywhere, literally.
This goes hand in hand with all the other struggles we've covered in labor news and interviewed various other workers and leaders across this country, and that includes the Amazon workers who continue to organize, from Chris Smalls, and the Teamsters gearing up. We did a great show on the Teamsters gearing up for their next contract campaign. We specifically did a show on 1997, the lessons of the Teamster strike against UPS in 97, which for me was very illuminating. And it was wonderful to talk to folks involved in that strike, doing the research before, and to be on here because all of us in some way participated in that strike in 97, supporting it in various ways. And of course, the Amazon struggle, which we mentioned, and many others. And this also all leads to the Railroad Workers United, which are on the move as well. And that exposed who the politicians really work for in Congress and many other places, but also showed the fight back spirit in the railroad workers and the huge outpouring of support across the country. There was many solidarity rallies in late November and early December, and still ongoing across the country for the Railroad Workers United, and many other labor actions taking place across this last year, which has been quite an upsurge in labor strikes, more than we've seen in a long time. And it's wonderful to be a part of it on this podcast. Rick?
Yeah, indeed. Speaking to the Amazon strike, and actually, all the struggles you just mentioned, for me in particular, the Amazon strike carries the lessons, or carries the example, I should say, of being an international struggle. And that's one of the things I love about it. Anytime you hear about any type of worker action here in the US, you often hear about the corresponding action of workers in Europe. And, I think these things are important. I think these things are significant. And I think that not only do they need to grow as far as, coordinated international actions, but this just needs to be the standard, in my opinion. We're in that age, and we've been at this age, honestly, for generations, as far as globalized capital. If there's globalized capital, then the workers' movement needs to be global. So we've been here for generations, if not centuries, really. So I think, we're finally at a stage where we're starting to see coordination of worker struggle on an international level, and that's really exciting. So for me personally, looking back, I'm looking at Starbucks, and as Jerry mentioned, it's been over 350 places that have seen some kind of organizing activity, and it's been organic, and it hasn't been called by institutionalized labor. And that's exciting on its own merit, right? And that's exciting because, it has just happened, again, spontaneously and organically. Now, Amazon is inspiring to me because we're starting to see that international stuff starting to coordinate a little bit more in their actions. And then the UPS Teamster struggle. Yeah, Bryan, like you said, we covered it on this podcast, the 1997 UPS struggle. And that was such a huge deal, because it was such an amazing victory, and it came with so many lessons. If you haven't listened to that episode of this podcast, I do recommend it. We lay out so many of the lessons that we could take away from the 1997 Teamster strike at UPS. like having to prepare for a strike a year and a half prior to the deadline date, having to build that labor community solidarity, having all the workers being able to speak on point about whatever issue it is you're fighting for, having the workers speak, that in and of itself, that was new and that was cool. I mean, this was the Teamsters, who not exactly known for their democratic processes. And so 1997 gave us a victory that we can still point to this day. It's still in our memories here. It's still in our collective memories. And we can still point to that. And we can even point to that and say, hey, that was a PowerPoint. That was the point where things were supposed to turn around after Patco, and they didn't quite do that, in my opinion, but it gave us some hope and showed us a lot of lessons that we can carry over to now, because the UPS contract is going to expire next year in July, and they have a new leadership, which does instill a little bit of hope. So yeah, it's been a pleasure covering, some of the Teamster activity, the Amazon activity, the Starbucks activity, and of course, my personal favorite. And how do you really pick and choose from all that? But my personal favorite, the one that kind of really, I feel, brought us to the brinks here, that was very exciting, and we'll see how this ends, is the railway strike. The railway strike was put a lot of stuff on the table. The railway strike showed us that the empire has a soft underbelly. It showed us that these corporations do have jugulars, and we've talked about the railway strike on here numerous times. We've analyzed it on all that. And the way I'm closing out the year on the railway strike is this. Yes, the corporations are money hungry. Yes, the shareholders are greedy. Yes, the owners are greedy. I've always taken that as a given. But for me, in hindsight, and this is again how I'm personally leaving off 2022, for me, it was a show that the capitalist class didn't want to show the rest of us that they have a soft underbelly. That's how I'm seeing it. That's how I'm analyzing it, because that was a perfect storm that aligned a lot of soft underbellies. It was the biggest consumer day of the year. The strike would have taken place shortly before the biggest consumer day of the year. It showed us how significant their labor is, and the rail system is, how much is dependent on this system of arteries, how much of the trade, how much of everyday market and economics is dependent on these 115,000 workers. That's yet another soft underbelly that I don't think, they wanted exposed all that much. So was it, to me, in my opinion, that ruthless usual greed of corporations? Yes. But again, this is my perspective, and I'm not speaking for Bryan or Jerry, or maybe I am, but I'm certainly just speaking for myself here. To me, it was these corporations not wanting to expose their soft underbelly. And I think that was one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue in that struggle. Your thoughts, comrades?
Well, I think it's good that you're pointing out sort of like the capitalist sort of issues involved with this labor upsurge, because one thing that seems to have gone unnoticed in all of this is that the union movement seems to be returning to industrial unions and away and private sector union victories and away from public sector. As we know, all the growth in the labor movement has come from public sector up until recently. I think the overall labor unionization rate in the country is around 12%, but it would be far less if you took away the public sector workers. And the private sector unionization rate in the US now is something like 6 or 7%. And despite that, what we're talking about with Amazon and Starbucks and the railroad workers is all this activity in the private sector, some of it in basic industry like railroads, for instance. And another feature which bears some repeating is that these labor struggles have come about through the agency of the workers in a rank and file organizing effort, sometimes against the wishes of their internationals and often without significant assistance from their internationals, certainly with Workers United and SEIU, for instance. So, which is an interesting thing that, especially when you look, I mean, private sector um, unionization is like really very, very important, especially with the right wing pushing right to work in places like Wisconsin and the Midwest, and sort of decimating and hurting our union movement from the state. Nevertheless, private sector unionization, led by mostly young workers, has has been like an antidote to that, and I think that bodes well for the future because, especially with the, I think there are about 8,000 or so Starbucks workers now that are unionized, and having gotten to know very many of them in the past year myself, they're it's radical youth, youth that have taught themselves how to be labor organizers and are not taking guff from anybody. So um, there's a lot that can be read between the tea leaves of this labor movement to give really a lot of heart to us out there.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot in process and a lot of things in flux, and it's moving forward in a positive direction. And I believe that the Railroad Workers United and the airline workers, which supported the railroad workers, the flight attendants that are organized into the CWA and the Flight Attendants Union. And we also interviewed Brother Clarence Thomas this last year from the ILWU. So if we look at the private sector is a much smaller density than the public sector, but still has very important strongholds on the U.S. capitalist economy. When we look at the airline industry, the railroad industry, which scared the hell out of the capitalists,
Yeah.
and also the docks from Washington State down to California and the areas now known as Hawaii and Alaska, all through the South. And it's different unions, right? The ILWU's on the West Coast, the ILA, from New Orleans all the way up to the East Coast. Every dock, the railroads, and a good portion of the airline industry is unionized. So that is quite something. And in the past, a lot of this has been kept separate, but with capitalism in the stage that it is and continuing to decline, and destroy the planet, especially here in the U.S., and the living conditions worsen and worsen, the workers in this country are seeing that they, despite if they're in the private sector or the public sector, or they might be a barista or they might be a railroad worker, they have a lot more in common than they do, apart. And of course, this is going to take time. There are workers, for example, white workers who need to sometimes learn about their prejudices and break that down. But for the most part, we'll be talking about Racine later and some of the lessons that we learned there. But also some of the things I think that's important to raise from our podcast this last year is that every place that we talked about that was successful or at least moving forward in a positive direction was rooted in a program from San Antonio, interviewing President Alejandro Lopez of the Alliance, to North Carolina, to our friends in Black Workers for Justice and the UE 150 there in the South. A couple of the items I took away from that was that, number one, you can't organize in some of the most extreme environments like the Jim Crow anti-labor laws in the South, and organizing is organizing. But also all of these struggles were rooted in a program that's rooted in labor and community solidarity, that they all understood, of course, were workers' organizations or unions that are organizing to improve wages, benefits, and working conditions of the workers that a given union or a worker organization represents. But to be successful, it has to be rooted in community struggles, in fighting racism, in supporting the LGBTQ community, and most importantly, in the future, to move forward with historically oppressed leadership. We also interviewed Brother Michael Jones of the Madison Teachers Union, 3,000 member teacher and personnel union in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's consistent across all these we just mentioned that they have a program, they're rooted in the community, they're very intentional about we are a multinational working class, but the most oppressed have to be in the leadership, and especially women and LGBTQ folks, the ones who suffer the most oppression under capitalism. And in my view, that's why successes and advances are being made. So again, this is all going to take time, and much of this is in flux. We had a great interview with Vermont as well. They have a program. We interviewed the president and the vice president there, and the same thing there. They have a program. They have a fighting program. It's rooted in a people's program. Economics and worker struggles are paramount to that, but it's much wider, much deeper than that. And also, they're talking about the war. They're talking about $850 billion for war while people starve to death and freeze to death in the United States, in the richest country on the planet. So these questions are being raised, and as these struggles intensify, we're going to see more solidarity and unity taking place. And this last year, I think, was wonderful hearing from a lot of these folks from all over the country, talking about and raising about and struggling over a lot of these different issues. And it's been an honor with being here with you two to interview our friends and fellow workers. And we look forward to continuing it and moving forward.
Likewise, this podcast, so our listeners know, this started when the three of us were at the People's Power Summit in Wisconsin, and the three of us were just chatting. We were just casually chatting about the labor movement in El Salvador, and we just got a little audience going there, and that's the usual kind of conversation that Bryan and I, because that's who I knew before the People's Power Summit, that's the usual kind of conversation that Bryan and I would have. And that's the conversation that I was having with Jerry on the spot. And that's how this podcast came into being, just saying to ourselves, well, this is really on par with what we do anyway. Why don't we just keep doing this and record it and share it somehow? So it's been an honor and a pleasure sharing the microphone with y'all. Thank you. And, Bryan, yeah, just kind of to jump on some of what you said, we've seen the rail struggle. It looks like we're getting ready for something as far as UPS, and also the airlines are unionized. And as you were listing those three, it reminded me of the movie Finally Got the News, which, if you haven't seen that movie, see that movie. That movie is about the worker struggle in Detroit, specifically the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and the League of Black Workers in Detroit. And man, that's a really insightful movie. Talks about the wildcat strikes that took place at Dodge, Maine, led by people like General Baker. And yeah, all the lessons coming out. But anyway, the point I wanted to make was, in that movie, they have an interview with one of the leaders. And when I saw it for the first time, it didn't hit me, but he listed the arteries of capitalism. He was like, look, there's certain places where workers have more power because of the type of work that they do. The rail system, the airlines, the postal system. And you know what? When we hear postal system, we usually just think of the United States Postal Service. And yes, they are unionized. And yes, they are critical. But like I just listed, UPS and the Teamsters, that's coming up. And, UPS is responsible for like 25 million packages a day. So their contract and their potential strike coming up is, something else to keep our ear to the ground with, and that's part of what I was saying as far as the capitalist ruling class not wanting to show its soft underbelly with the railway system, was because if they allowed the railway workers to gain any kind of victory or to flex their labor muscle like that, well, whatever was happening there was going to be setting a precedent for UPS. And frankly, that's how I'm seeing this struggle moving forward, is that's how things went down. But nevertheless, this podcast has kept us informed on current events as far as labor issues, but also it's brought a wealth of theoretical lessons for me personally. I'm guessing for you too, comrades, a wealth of theoretical lessons from the people that we've interviewed. just like Bryan said, some of the people that we've had on here, Black Workers for Justice, the San Antonio Alliance, they are connected and rooted in the community. And I think that's critical to today's labor struggle, is having that connection with the community. Also, I think that another huge theoretical lesson that was dropped on here by Black Workers for Justice, I had also mentioned it, or if I hadn't mentioned it on here, it's something that I talk about often, is how a union is nothing more than a group of workers. And I think that's an important lesson that we had on here when Black Workers for Justice was on here. But I also think it's a lesson that the Starbucks workers are teaching us right now, because this isn't institutionalized labor. This isn't, SEIU, the UAW, the Teamsters, nothing against them, not knocking on them, but, they already have their structure defined. They already have their processes defined. And these Starbucks workers, they're the living embodiment of that. They're just a group of workers acting precisely as a union. So that's also particularly important. And yeah, I guess the last artery worth mentioning, although there are more, but from our conversations here on this podcast and, from our own lessons and from the movie Finally Got the News, is also the ports, the docks, and we had brother Clarence Thomas on this show talking about, his life on the docks and the lessons and the experience that they had. And I think that's another show that we can really highlight from this year. There were a lot of lessons to be learned from that interview with brother Clarence Thomas. Everything from the the types of strikes that they carried out on the docks and the reasons, all the way to where and how he was politicized. The brother was talking about how his parents would invite the Panthers to their home to have study groups and stuff like that. And, that speaks to some of the labor stuff that brother Clarence Thomas was able to carry out and participate in the ILWU. So, yes, it's been an incredible year as far as this podcast and the things that I've learned and the things that we've been able to put out. I wanted to thank you, comrades, brothers, Bryan, Jerry. Also, a particular shout out to Anastasia, who has really helped promote the show, has gone out of the way. She's one of our biggest fans. But yeah, this podcast has taken us to places I never even thought we could go. One of those places being Racine, Wisconsin, and the way we got involved in that, here, let me start here. If you go back to the interviews with brother Yassin Mahdi from UAW Local 180, you start learning about Local 180 strike at CNH Industrial and what's going on there. And if I may, Bryan, and you can fill in some gaps here, but the reasons we started getting involved is because Bryan is also very deeply rooted in the labor community in Wisconsin. And we just saw an opportunity to be able to participate and extend some solidarity to the struggle happening at Local 180. And so we started getting more involved and communicating and keeping in touch with President Yassin Mahdi. And we organized a Solidarity Day. Bryan mostly organized a Solidarity Day, really. And yeah, we participated in that. And Bryan, if you could tell us your take on that. How did that all come together? What were some of the lessons that you learned? I'd also like to share mine, but Bryan, you really got the ball rolling with that one. So how did that happen in your mind? What did you see?
Well, thanks, Rick. Yeah, I mean, it was a collective situation. And for our listeners, we should all remind ourselves that in 1936 is when the UAW 180, United Auto Workers 180, formed there in Racine, and it was known as a variety of different names over the years, most notably Case Holland. This is a company that makes agricultural and farm implements in Racine, and then construction equipment in Burlington, Iowa, which has 400 workers there. And in this particular situation, in the past, they've been locked out, they've been on strikes before, but this is really a foundational CIO local going back 85 years. So besides the fact that these members have been on strike since May 2nd, 2022, this time, it has a very, very rich and deep history in the city of Racine, affecting generations of family members and loved ones and community members and small businesses and so much more there in Racine and across the Midwest and the world, and workers in so many different ways. So when we interviewed President Yassin Mahdi in September, we have been helping the strike since May, doing a lot of support work over the summer. But we realized that when we interviewed him, the company had stopped bargaining at the table on September 29th. That was their last, best, and final offer. That this local really needed some help to help re-energize the strike and to add upon what the courageous and brave workers had already been doing at that time, which have been out on strike already for months in September. And they're out there 4 to 6 hours every day on these picket lines in the hot sun, the cold winter weather. Many of them have families. A week after they went on strike, the barbaric company cut off health insurance.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't for the union and the UAW having a fund, and by the way, that's collective across the country. So if a local goes out on strike and an outrageously barbaric company cuts off the health insurance, many of these workers have been working at this place for decades and decades. So they cut off their health insurance, and they were surviving by strike funds, $400 a week, plus the health insurance. And then some of them had to get part-time jobs or survive on their spouses or loved ones helping them, or donations to the union hall. After learning all this from President Mahdi in more depth, we decided to propose a Solidarity Day to them. We had a lot of discussions about that. They were for that, and we called the day for December 17th. So we started organizing for this in November, weeks and weeks in advance. We asked supporters that one of the most important things is concrete assistance, because for those of you all who haven't been on strike, it's a pretty heavy thing to do it one day, much less months. So they needed a lot of concrete assistance for strike funds, for concrete non-perishable goods, gift cards, winter gear as winter was coming on. And then we did a lot of support work. So everybody on this podcast, Jerry, Rick, and our friends, our labor supporters, both in Wisconsin, the Midwest, and beyond, helped make a variety of phone calls, outreach, media, on-the-ground support. A lot of our labor friends did all kinds of different work, supporting, from the Milwaukee Area Labor Council to Madison, South Central Federation of Labor, to many labor and community supporters, and that includes the Wisconsin AFL-CIO. Labor really supported this in Wisconsin, got the word out. We led up and went into Solidarity Day strong, and Rick flew in, and we did a Solidarity School a week before the strike in the Union Hall, and that was a wonderful experience. And I'm hoping Rick can talk to us a bit about his own personal experience through that. But for me, it was quite something. It was really one thing to support a strike from far away, but it's another thing to be in a hall for days and days, making placards and making signs and making banners, and seeing food brought in, and seeing people who literally sat in their living rooms at home and made scarves and hats and gloves for these strikers, and brought in food and gift cards. And these workers who were making these donations, they are low-wage workers themselves. They don't make much money, and some of them are workers, and they were bringing in food from their families and figuring out how to support these strikers. And we had cultural events and food brought in to help us on our art builds that we did, and those types of activities. So it was quite a week, and we led into Solidarity Day, and it was a resounding success. We can talk about it a lot more in detail, but in short, hundreds of labor and community supporters showed up. A UAW local in Kokomo, Indiana, came by and dropped $6,100 to the strike fund, and tens of thousands of dollars were raised by the time we called the Solidarity Day until December 17th, all day long on December 17th, from the morning until late afternoon. People were bringing in supplies. Folks showed up from Burlington, Iowa, Railroad Workers United, educators, teachers, school personnel. Detroit showed up, a retired auto worker and retired firefighter, and so much more. It was hundreds. We had car toppers that we made. We traveled to the picket lines with dozens and dozens of cars with slogans such as "Si se puede," and we had speakers that talked to the international component of this, that we have to be united with workers around the world to win any kind of battle against a multinational company. Rick gave a great speech on that. We had speakers from the Madison teachers who we interviewed on here, Brother Michael Jones, Christine Newman Ortiz from Voces de la Frontera, Family Farm Defenders. And we did all this very consciously, right? It was a solidarity situation, but also to give tactics and to give ideas to the workers because they make agricultural and farm equipment, right? So we had farmers there speaking, farm workers, to develop these relationships for the future because the strike is not over. The company's still not coming back to the table, so we needed to have a strong show of support, but also to do ideas and tactics. And Rick did a great job on corporate research and suggesting that to some of the local members there and leaders. And now, after this very successful action, we're poised to continue to help this local to win this strike and to move forward with it.
Yeah, that's right. It carried so many lessons, honestly. And I think, Bryan, you already spoke to some of the biggest takeaways for me is what does it take? And it took all that. It took the phone calls to the media. It took, the reaching out to other labor groups. It took reaching out to community groups. It took coordination. It took, the act of setting dates and times and the act of organizing people. We need your donations towards a strike fund. We need your food donations. That's what it actually takes. And I'll be real with you. While we were in Racine, man, I was seeing the support come in. People come in personally with checks and food and stuff like that. And it really fills your heart with hope. For me personally, it's like, wow. It's like, man, why? Like humanity can come together and take care of itself. But here we are, for a matter of survival, having to sell our time and labor to this capitalist class who only wants it for their profit. But left to its own devices, yeah, humanity, I think we got this. I think we could figure something out. Will it be easy? No. Will it be pretty? No. But can we in the end? Yes. And to me, seeing all the activity and the support, the solidarity, and frankly, the love that just came in on Solidarity Day and the days surrounding Solidarity Day, that instilled a great deal of hope in my heart, and taught me a great deal of lessons of what it takes to, support a strike or get any type of labor action like that done. Another huge lesson from me that I would like to go on record on this podcast and share with our listeners. Another huge lesson for me was Solidarity Day in and of itself. Okay. It was just a day of action. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't a boycott. It wasn't the type of worker action that a union could be penalized for, fined for. No one could call an injunction against this. It was just organized separately, but still in support of the union. And I think that is a huge and valuable lesson, both in and of itself, and also it speaks to some of the stuff that we've been talking about all along. The need for that community alliance, because the community can do things that institutionalized unions cannot, because the labor laws in the US are so strict against unions that we have to be creative with our methods. And forging these community alliances, I think, are key to carrying out some labor struggles, because frankly, community groups can do things that we can't do. Community groups can call boycotts. Community groups can call protests, can go out and speak to the media, and also base the same opinions, base the same analysis, base the same demands as union workers, but they're doing it as community members. And I think that is instrumental, key, if not just straight up slick, man. I think there's a huge lesson to be learned in that, and I wanted to go on the record and share that on the air. So yeah, thank you, Bryan, for putting that out in all our faces. And thank you for the workers in Racine and the supporters who came out and reminded us of this lesson.
In addition to that, I'd like to hear Jerry and just let our listeners know that Jerry's a member also, besides this podcast, of Pride at Work in Boston, longtime labor community solidarity activist who made a lot of outreach calls and helped. And that was what was instrumental to making this day a success. The sound was donated, placards were donated, sticks were donated, food was donated. A lot of that came from union members, but also came from community members or community members who had retired, who were union members at one time. For example, we had hosts that housed people that came to town that were former retirees that had been educators, that had been involved in strikes and struggles before. So there's no excuses where this type of activity cannot be done. It's there. And yes, Wisconsin does have a rich labor history and a rich community history of fight back and unions, but this can be done all over the country. Folks were more than willing to help. There was many opportunities to help, to pitch in, and literally during the course of the week that we were there, hundreds of people literally came up,
Right.
dropped food, dropped donations, helped in somehow, some way. And like our friend Bobby Sands always said, who was murdered by Margaret Thatcher in 1981 by the British after he was on hunger strike for 66 days, he said that everyone has a part to play, no matter how small. And what we learned in Racine, that was so true. That if you brought some chicken soup, that was important.
Mhm.
If you brought a gift for a child, that was huge. When we got there, the hall, yes, it was filled with some food and it was filled with some gifts, but due to the collective effort of all the folks in Wisconsin, actually, there's probably thousands of people in the Midwest and Wisconsin and across the country who sent in checks and gift cards and dropped off gifts. That hall, when we left on Saturday to go back to our respective locations, was packed with food and with holiday gifts for those children of the strikers. And we cannot emphasize how critical and important that was. That concrete assistance was critical, but that combated demoralization. That let these workers know that they're not out there alone in 20-degree weather, that there are thousands and more that have their back. And that will help them continue this struggle and to move forward. And it was quite a day. And it was damn cold out there, 15 to 20 degrees. And yet hundreds of people showed up. And then they got in their cars. They went to the picket lines. They put these huge car toppers on their vehicles. And then they had another rally down by the picket line for a couple more hours. So they were out there for hours in the bitter cold. And so the lessons in this are leadership, organization, and having faith in the workers and having faith in our community. For me, that's what it's about. And we do. There are so many opportunities out there to organize and to fight back, even under the most extreme conditions. And if anybody knows anything about Wisconsin in the past 10 years, with Jim Crow laws like Act 10 and eviscerating collective bargaining rights and right to work and eliminating prevailing wage and all the other austerity, you might think that we couldn't have pulled something like this off, but we did. And it was a collective effort of labor and community solidarity that did it. And we're going to continue to move forward with it.
Yes.
So, Jerry?
Yeah, and just to say something about you, Bryan, I mean, your roots in Wisconsin labor go way back with your family to the Kohler strike, and you know, you're a rank and file activist, and I think it is important to point out that the initiative for mobilizing and reaching out to all sectors of Wisconsin labor, you know, did come from your voice, because you uh, just could not sit by and see this foundational UAW local get smashed by this heartless corporation. And furthermore, because you were so involved in the occupation in Milwaukee 12 years ago, when Scott Walker was riding high and ultimately passed Act 10 to bring right to work to Wisconsin, you were very much involved in mobilizing people to take over the state house there. And your memory of that in your interest is something that uh, you know, just wouldn't sit by and allow this to happen. So, you know, the mobilization of the springs basically from people who care, and people responded to your call, basically, to get up and let's mobilize labor in Wisconsin.
uh, to get out there and take care of business here. And fortunately, and it says a lot about Wisconsin labor that they heeded your call. They were not afraid for, I mean, you're not a member of the union. You don't even live in Wisconsin right now, but they were not afraid to listen to your suggestions and your urging, and they responded. So labor has within itself the capacity to be mobilized. And against all odds, this happened. This Racine mobilization for the UAW 180 happened. And it's the big lesson here for me. I mean, I think, Ric, you talked about lessons to be learned, and Bryan, so have you, was that this, your interest, Bryan, our interest, dare I say, is in our class, our working class. And you've got to care about the workers, about the families, about the struggle, about the sacrifice, and about workers fighting back. And without that impulse, it's hard to to take care of business. And that impulse comes down low to the ground, without self-interest, without a hidden agenda. We here in this pocket, we don't have any agenda. We have our own values and beliefs, which hopefully are coming through to anybody that listens to this program. But we're not employed by anybody. We're doing this because of our lived experience and what we've seen in labor, and how proud it has made us of the working class and the best of our union movement in this country. So what we've been trying to do with this labor podcast is like basically labor education, amplifying the honest voices of the rank and file leadership in this country, which every one of our podcasts has done that, because these voices are being they've been extinguished. And it's up to us to amplify these voices and bring forth our leaders and extol them and help mobilize them and be assistance to labor and to our class. That's our mission. And I think especially you and Ric really took care of business when you went out there, and you really sacrificed to go out there. But I know you had it in your hearts to do that. And we love our class, we love our working class, and we love the best in labor, which has motivated us. And we're not going to sit by and let the labor movement be sort of frozen in this country. But you know something? The labor movement is going to go on and mobilize. It's right now, it's taken off. Pro-union sentiment is higher now than it's been in decades and decades, and it's not showing any signs at all of diminishing. In fact, it's gaining strength as time goes by. So let's keep the faith, and let's labor education, because the three of us are labor educators who went to labor school to be labor educators, but we become union organizers and rank and file leaders also. So we don't have an agenda here except to do what is best and to support our sisters and brothers out there. And my hat is off to Ric and Bryan for everything that you did. And it's, it's going to reverberate. And so we're not going to forget Racine. This was one battle in the struggle, but there are more battles to come. Absolutely.
That's right. And I also want to underscore something that you said, Jerry. Bryan is a rank and file activist. I'm a rank and file activist. We're not union presidents here. We're not vice presidents. We don't have tens of thousands of or millions of dollars at our disposal. Bryan and I basically just had our credit card, maybe some cash to throw around from our own jobs, and we were able to pull this off. So it's not always about the millions of dollars. It's not always about having the officer position or the staff job or anything like this. This can be done by rank and filers or rank and file activists. So yeah, I just wanted to underscore that, because that was another huge lesson, or better stated, another huge reminder for me. And also speaking to something else you said, Jerry, some of this stuff has been extinguished. And I think it's important for us to put it back in the forefront. When we were getting ready for our interview with Jeff Kurtz from Railway Workers United, before we jumped on and actually started recording, he made reference to forgotten strikes. Now, I had never heard those two words one next to the other. And it broke my heart and it infuriated me at the same time. Those two words should not go together, forgotten and strike. No, there should be no forgotten strikes. We've talked about it on here before. Strikes, that's when gloves are off. That's when the fight is on. That's the spark in the whole class struggle thing. That's when we have to come out and support our brothers and sisters the same way most people come out and support their sports team. Man, imagine if people came out and supported their union brothers or sisters. Imagine if people came out and supported the working class the way they do, their favorite sports, the way they do the Yankees, the way they do the Broncos, the way they do, whatever football base. Imagine that. I think that if people supported these struggles the same way we do our sports teams, and no disrespect to that, right? Like I like my own type of sports too. But if folks supported this stuff the same way that they supported some of their favorite sports teams, man, this would be a different fight. This would be a different struggle. This would be a different world, in my opinion. So yeah, a lot of lessons to gain from Racine, Wisconsin, and I'm thankful to Bryan for taking the charge in that. I'm thankful for the folks at Local 180 who let us in. I'm thankful to the teacher in Wisconsin, in Racine, Wisconsin, who took us under her roof. She was a retired educator who had gone on Wildcat strike in the late 70s. So yeah, that trip was lesson upon lesson upon lesson for us, and we thank you. We hope that you, Local 180, have benefited from some of these actions. We hope to continue working with y'all and carrying the struggle forward. So that's the year in recap here at We Rise Fighting. Thank you everyone who's tuned in and listened to our show and has been excited and sent feedback and shared our show. You have schooled us in so many ways. To me, this feels like we did another semester at UMass Labor Center. Man, we had people coming on talking about the Black workers struggle, talking about the dock struggle, talking about the anti-fascist struggle in Vermont, community building, community organizing. Man, we just had professors, if you will, roll in and just school us or remind us or make some things crystal clear. So we wanted to thank you too, the people who have come on here and given us some insight as far as the struggle, as far as labor current events or labor news or analysis. We wanted to thank all of you. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. With this show, this is how we extend our love and solidarity. Thank you all for listening. We will be back next year. We will continue to grow the program and shape it according to whatever seems fit, whatever makes sense to us. This is a work in progress. It has always been, and that's been part of the fun. It's been an experiment. So thank you, Bryan, and thank you, Jerry, for sharing the microphone with me. Much love for that, and much love to you just for being the people who you are. And tune in again to We Rise Fighting next year. We have more shows coming, and we hope you enjoy them and benefit from them. Thank you, everyone. Love and solidarity to all.
All right.